And okay, we are going to start with our featured topic today is inflation, economic outlooks, and the cost of inputs for farming and ranching in 2023. And we are very honored to have Professor Brigid Tuck with us. She is the Senior Economic Impact Analysis for University of Minnesota Extension. She helps communities understand the drivers of economic change. Recently, Brigid has been studying how the changes stemming from the pandemic are playing out at the community level, including on farms. Living on her family farm, Brigid also sees those impacts firsthand. Brigid has her master's degree in applied economics. So with that, we will start with Brigid.
Hey,
Thank you again for being here.
Sure, you could blame the calendar invite issue, or you could say that people think economists are boring and didn't want to come to this. Either way, I can
absolutely not.
So thanks for having me today. As mentioned, I work for the University of Minnesota Extension. So I am coming at you from southern Minnesota, the traditional homelands of the Dakota people from my area of the state. So I just wanted to start by kind of giving you a little bit of an overview of sort of inflation and the economy and sort of how we got here, and then maybe give you guys some tips for thinking about what's going to happen next as we look forward into the future. So I always like to, because I am an economist, I know I make fun of us for being boring, but I always like to come back to Economics 101 when I think about what's happening right now out there. So if you remember back to your economics courses, you can
Brigid,
remember. Yeah,
Brigid,
can
you put your slides on
back this way?
Reading pane? There we go.
Okay.
And go down to the bottom and
Okay.
hit the button. Reading pane will be easier for you. No, 1/1, that one. Yep.
There we go. Thank you.
There you go.
Appreciate it. Thank you. So I always like to go back to Economics 101 here. And if you remember, we get prices when we set supply and demand, right? So where the supply and the demand curve meet, that's where we set prices and quantity. So if we think about what's been happening here in the last year or two, what we're really seeing is that we're seeing a shift both in demand and supply. So when demand shifts, as demand increases, that increases price. It also hopefully increases quantity. So we see that shift on the demand curve. But we're also seeing shifts in supply. So we're seeing kind of a decrease, or we're having some supply restrictions. And when supply restricts, then we also see increases in price. So from both sides of this equation, we're seeing changes in the economy that are pushing our prices up, and we're getting inflation. So I thought I'd talk just for a few minutes this morning about what's going on with demand, what's going on with supply, and sort of how that intersects with our ag economy out there. So if we look at changes in demand, what we've really seen is just a wild ride of consumer spending. So the consumer drives about 60 to 70% of our economy in any given year. So even though they're not necessarily knocking on farm doors, although some are through ag tourism, what the consumer is doing really does affect what's happening at the global level for the United States. So you can see here, this is the percent change in consumer spending from quarter to quarter. And what happened there, the first couple pieces there are 2019 spending in 2019. You can see that consumers were, generally increasing their spending by about 1%. Then comes COVID, and we see this huge swing, like consumers pull back in one quarter, the next quarter they spend, more than they were spending before, just these wild swings, which is really tough for our businesses to try to deal with. But then as you look here, as we've come out of that into 2021, we continue into 2022, we continue to see consumers spending at higher rates than they spent before the pandemic, and continue to increase their spending. And so that's putting a lot of pressure on the economy. There is a lot of demand out there. And when we have that high demand, we start to see those prices rise. And we particularly saw this in our manufacturing sector. So if you look at where the demand change was, this is from 2019 to 2021. A lot of that change happened in our manufacturing sector. And what's really starting to happen, especially out in our kind of rural areas, is that manufacturers have this huge demand on them. And so they're trying to increase to meet that demand. And what's happening is we're starting to really see pressure on wages. And so I'll get into that in a minute here, but we're starting to really see a lot of, as they try to they're kind of sucking up labor. And as they do that, we see prices continue to rise. And so when we look kind of like, how do these trends impact agriculture? I wanted to talk just a little bit about land. I wanted to talk a little bit about labor, and then I'm going to leave it to David to talk a little bit about what's happening with inputs. But these are kind of the three big pieces that go into agriculture, right? So when we talk about labor, the pressure on labor has just been absolutely intense. So this is the percent change in the labor force participation rate from just before COVID hit to October of 2021. And what we see is that kind of across the board, participation in labor force has been down. It continues to be down. But where we see the greatest decreases in labor force participation rate is amongst our college, over 25, no college education. And this is exactly the same people that manufacturing, agriculture, construction, these are the people that they're kind of trying to hire. This is the skill set they need. And there are fewer of them out there in the workforce. So again, as those manufacturers can raise wages to meet demand, it leaves the other industries that are want those same employees are struggling a little bit more. And then particularly frightening, especially if you happen to live in Minnesota, is that the baby boomers have really decreased their engagement in the workforce. And we in Minnesota especially needed the baby boomers to keep working as we look at our changing population dynamics here. And what this is happening is that this is leaving a lot of jobs unfilled. So this is the job vacancies across the United States. And you can see this huge spike up in 2022. We just continue to see more jobs than we really have people to work them. And so again, if you're looking in your farm operations, as we're looking at what's going to happen in agriculture going forward, as you try to find labor, you're going to be competing with more and more job openings to try to find those people. And that's putting pressure on wages. So this is the average weekly wage, average hourly earnings kind of across the United States. You can see prior to the pandemic, that little blip is the pandemic there. We were kind of growing in that 2-year period beforehand. Wages grew at a rate of about 7.3%. In the 2 years following that little blip, wages rising at closer to 9%. So labor is getting harder to find and it's getting more expensive. So for farmers and people that need to hire someone to help them, that's going to continue to be a real issue going into 2023. And I think the question is sort of what's going to happen with labor. So I love this chart. This is for Minnesota. We are particularly labor challenged here. But the gold here is the job vacancies. So that's the number of job openings. And the red line is the number of people who are unemployed. So across Minnesota, we have way more job openings than we really have people even looking for work. And so I think we have some room, when we talk about potential recession or what might be happening, we still have a lot of room to where we get kind of equilibrium in those two figures. But I think the big two questions out there about what's going to happen with labor, are we going to see some easing in this labor market, is what's going to happen with the baby boomers? Are some of them going to come back into the workforce? And then, of course, our kind of immigration and especially again for Minnesota, where it's the 15th of November and we got 2 or 3 inches of snow. We're not exactly the destination for all people. We don't get a lot of people moving into Minnesota, so we rely on that immigration to help with our labor force as well. So what happens with immigration trends is also going to put pressure on that labor force. The other thing that's kind of crazy, if you just look at it, if you're thinking about agriculture and kind of our big inputs, land is a big piece of that, especially for people who are trying to come into agriculture. If you're new to this and trying to enter the market, land prices are also really high. And they've just been, I was just astounded when I pulled this data. So this is by region of the United States. The percent change in the price of land for cropland from 2021 to 2022 is the maroon. So like the northern plains, like Kansas, Nebraska, those states up by 20%. Kansas was up by 25%. The Corn Belt, which is more Illinois, Indiana, they're up about 15%. The Lakes, which is Minnesota, Wisconsin, also up in that 15% range. And then the gold there is the change from 2018 to 2019, just to give you a sense of how crazy these price changes are. And part of that is because the farm incomes continue to be strong. So as long as farm income is high and farmers can afford to put more into land, they will. And then also because a lot of investors use land as an inflation hedge. And so as we see inflation increase, we're seeing demand for land, and then we're seeing prices go up for land as well. So that's kind of the demand side, where we're seeing prices getting pushed up on the demand side. On the supply side, we still continue to see that global insecurity. So I think David will talk a little bit about some of these factors, but we are having trouble getting some of our imports, and that's absolutely putting pressure on prices for things like fertilizer and chemicals, tire parts, computer chips. Equipment is getting harder to get some of those parts and repair done. So we're seeing that pressure as well. So what's going to happen going into 2023? Here's the things I think you need to be watching when it comes to the farm economy. First is consumer demand for food. For many of you, if you're selling livestock and that's going for food consumption, it's absolutely going to be affected by what the consumer is doing. The other thing is to look at interest rates. So the Federal Reserve in Minneapolis did a great presentation this morning talking about what's happening kind of in the ag lending market. As interest rates continue to tick up, they're still sort of not at real historic highs in agriculture. But as we start to tick up, you know, our farmers going to be able to get those operating loans that they need to continue into next year. Again, those land prices and how are they going to be able to afford the land piece of it as well becomes more of a concern. And then just kind of how is the Federal Reserve going to approach inflation? So as we look at the Federal Reserve basically has one tool, and that is to change interest rates. But if part of the problem, if part of the reason we're seeing prices rise is because of supply issues, the Federal Reserve can't really even tackle that. So as the Federal Reserve continues to make the moves it needs to make and that it can make, how is that going to play out in the rest of the economy? So just a little bit of a quick comment on what's happening with consumer spending for food. We do start to see some signs that consumers are starting to slow down their food purchases. As inflation creeps in and we get more and more concerned about our grocery budgets, consumers are pulling back. So this is adjusted for inflation, but it's a percent change in consumer spending in two major categories, groceries, and you can see absolutely the last 3 quarters that consumers are spending less on groceries. The red is restaurants and accommodations. Unfortunately, hotels are in that category, but you can see also some signs of slowing in that spending. So as the consumer pulls back, again, if you're selling livestock or anything like that, you might start to see some slacking demand there. Food away from home is feeling a little bit less of that inflation pressure. So this is inflation percent change from the year before. And I put the last 3 months in there just so you can see, we are starting to see some signs that inflation is decreasing a little bit across the board. But if you look at food in general is a little bit higher than inflation across all items, but food at home is seeing much more of an increase in the prices than food away from home. And I think part of this is because restaurants and bars are a little bit slower to increase their prices. They're not seeing as much of a recovery from COVID either, so they're a little hesitant to raise prices where it can happen faster at the grocery store. And then I just put a couple of the energy kind of related there at the end because I know those absolutely affect farm operations as well. So I think the things for you to watch going forward is what is the consumer going to do? And I think we have the tale of two consumers here. On the left-hand side, we have the things that are slowing consumers down, that are making them spend less money. You know, rising prices and rising interest rates are absolutely starting to take a bite out of the consumer. Maybe we can go a couple of months where we can pay those higher prices and kind of be okay, but we're getting to the point where I think the consumer is going to start to make some changes. Meat and especially is getting expensive, so do they kind of move away from some of those purchases. On the right are kind of the two things that could keep the consumer spending, right? As long as you feel secure in your job, which a lot of people right now, we know it's kind of a worker marketplace out there. There's a lot of unfilled jobs if I should get fired, so I feel good about my job. And as long as they continue to feel their incomes are solid, I think the consumer will keep spending. So that's kind of my prediction. If you watch what happens in 2023, I think which way the consumer goes on these two is going to have a big influence on the economy. So I will end it there.
Okay. Those are some startling numbers, actually. Okay, so we're going to go to our next speaker, and then we will do a combined question and answering at the very end. And so our federal agency resource is David Williams. He is an agriculture economist in the farm economy branch of the Resource and Rural Economy Division. He joined the USDA's Economic Research Service in January of 2022. His research centers on agricultural finance and farm household well-being. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Vicki. And hi, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to be presenting the latest cost of production forecast estimates that we have, and also presenting some of the other information that the ERS puts out that I think would be beneficial for all of you to be aware of the resources available to you. So Blanket disclaimer, this is not a USDA presentation, so I have to throw this in here. This is basically me talking. I'm not, this is not officially, the USDA speaking. This is me speaking as an economist, the worst of the USDA. And hopefully this is the most boring part of the presentation. I just wanted to throw this out here. This is the mission statement of the ERS. The mission of the USDA's Economic Research Service is to anticipate trends, emerging issues in agriculture, food, the environment, and rural America, and to conduct high quality, objective economic research to inform and enhance public and private decision-making. And the reason I wanted to throw that out there is because in order to conduct good research that is impactful and not just interesting to economists talking to other economists, is we need stakeholder feedback. And so if you have any issues that you think have not been researched yet and you are passionate about them and think that they should be researched, please reach out to me or another representative in the ERS, and we can share it with our colleagues and incorporate your feedback into our research agenda. And this year, as a testament to that, we are oversampling socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers in our 2022 surveys. So if this is a glimmer of optimism, this is it. If there is a glimmer of optimism in this presentation, this is it. Cash receipts generally trend alongside production expenses. And we saw that in this graph from 2009 to 2019, which was a part of a report on the agricultural income and finance situations, which is freely available on the ERS website, and is also true for the latest forecast of 2022. Net farm income is up, and production expenses are up, and so is net farm income. It's not true for every producer, and some producers are having a bad year, but speaking generally, cash receipts and production expenses do trend together. Now this chart is from the same report and shows the largest expense categories as a share of total cash expenses. And you can see that from 2009 to 2019, these production expense shares are relatively stable. But if you were to throw 2022 on there, you would see that interest expense is higher and fertilizer is higher. And so that is more of a testament to the uniqueness of this year and world events that affected these specific production expenses. This is a table from another report, the Major Land Use Report, which is also freely available on our website. And it shows a breakdown of major land uses using data from the 2012 Census of Agriculture. And you can see that across American Indian reservations, there are approximately 63 million acres of farmland, and 47 million of those acres are dedicated to grassland, pasture, and range, i.e. livestock purposes. And 6 million acres of that is cropland. And so I looked at the 2017 data and tried to tabulate what commodities are being produced by American Indian producers. And the largest ones are tabulated here: 87,000 acres of barley, over 500,000 acres of corn, 1.1 million acres of hay, and over 1.3 million acres of wheat, 500,000 of soybean, and 828,000 heads of cattle, 130,000 heads of hogs. So compared to the typical, or compared to the national average, American Indian producers are more heavily concentrated in livestock, which makes sense if geographically they're more dispersed on the west. So here is another, this table is also found in that first report that I mentioned, the Agricultural Outlook. And it shows the production expenses by farmer and ranch specialization. And this is useful for farmers that want to benchmark themselves, see how their production compares to other farmers, the national average. And for later purposes, when I present the latest input expense forecasts, it's going to be useful to look at field crops and beef cattle or other livestock specifically. And the biggest difference between those these expense categories would be the field crops obviously have a lot of seed and plants and fertilizer inputs, while beef cattle and other livestock have much more feed and livestock purchases. Now that's some background, and we can finally talk about something that's more tangible and important. Looking at how this is the production expenses per acre of major field crops. And you can see that the percentage change from 2021 to 2022 varied between about 4.8% for cotton on the low end to a high of about 10% for corn. And the good news here is that as of June 22nd, when these estimates were produced, we are predicting that the cost to produce each acre of these commodities are going to go down by about 1 to 2%. Now, unfortunately, this isn't very timely data, and I apologize. The latest estimates actually come out today in about 90 minutes. But even if I knew what those new estimates were going to be, I wouldn't be allowed to disclose them before they're publicly available. So, but if you Google USDA ERS cost of production forecast, it'll be the top Google result. And we have data going back all the way to 1975. So very useful tools that are freely available. There's not another industry in the United States where the US government does all of your market research for you. So please use that information. Now, from the same report, they estimated that in 2022, CPI was going to be about 6.85%, and it has been demonstrated that it's a little closer to 8%. And they were predicting that in 2023, the CPI was going to be about 2.5% in 2023. If any economist ever pretends that they have a crystal ball and tells you this is what CPI is going to be in the next year, my personal opinion, turn around, don't listen to them. They're just more of a talking head than they are an actual economist. But in my opinion, that 2.5% in 2023 is low. Now, the 13.32% average here is the average increase in production item categories for 2022. But depending on which production category, which expenses you use, your average might have been a little higher or lower than that. So the crop increases were an average of between 4 and 11%. So that 13.3 is unnecessarily high. But the average for 2023 is up 0.343%. But as I showed earlier, forecast to decrease for field crops by about 2% on average. Now, for the individual expense categories, some are increasing and some are decreasing. And we could spend hours on this slide talking about the what ifs. What if the war in Ukraine keeps on going and then they're not able to produce fertilizer for more or for longer? Then fertilizer could increase in price instead of decrease. Same with fuel. There's just so much to talk about. But the big thing here is that interest expense is predicted to increase by 22%. And I want to mention that because it's the biggest number, it's the scariest number, but that is because it is a big percentage increase of a small number. We're coming out of a period of historically low interest rates. And so while interest rates are much higher now than they have been, looking back 20, 30, 40 years, the interest rates are really not that high. Currently, when I made this slide, mortgage rates were about 7.6%, but you should be aware and contact your farm service agent representatives because their interest rates are considerably lower than the free market, competitive market interest rate. So you can see that they go down to about 4.5% for a direct farm loan compared to 7.5% for a mortgage loan. So use these resources that are available to you. You take advantage of those subsidized interest rates. And if you're trying to talk about, or I'm not going to give financial advice. I'm not here to give financial advice. I'm here to give information. But I know the natural first question that people want to ask when they talk about rising interest rates is, well, what should I do? Should I wait for them to go back down, or what should I do? And personally, I'm in the middle of buying a house. My interest rate is going to be around 7.5%. If it goes down, you can always refinance. And if it goes up, well, then you're going to be kicking yourself for not getting in the game earlier. And at the end of the day, my opinion is things cost what they cost. You need what you need, but that's all I can say about that. So some big key takeaways here are that per acre production expenses of major field crops are predicted to decrease by a couple percentage points in 2023. And in about 90 minutes, we'll get the latest estimates. And even if they're a little bit higher, the good news is that even if it doesn't bring us back down to what they were in 2021, at least now you're accustomed to these higher prices. And so there's less of a sticker shock when you have to pay for it. As for livestock producers, whether you have an increase or decrease is really going to depend on how much, depending on your inventory purchases. But the good thing there is that when the cost of inventory purchases goes up, prices when you sell that livestock are also going to be correlated and be higher as well. So please take advantage of all the free information and all of the research that the ERS puts out. When economists write journal articles, we're just talking to each other and the language is very difficult to comprehend, and we try to impress each other with our big vocabularies. But when the ERS puts out a report, we try and talk to stakeholders, and we try and make the information and the research accessible. So please take advantage of it. The US government is paying for market research for farmers and ranchers. Take advantage of it. And as I said at the beginning, if you have any specific research interests, or you think something is important and you haven't seen an economist talk about it yet, please let us know so we can incorporate it into our agenda and better serve you. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And David and Brigid, will you also put your emails in our chat, because that is sent out? Do we have any questions? Maureen?
Yeah. So a couple questions. First, David, can you talk at all to the impact of the war in Ukraine on the cost of inputs, in particular fertilizer? And do you see that in the projections that you've done so far in your research? Do you see that changing in 23 or staying the same as it is now?
So I think that's really going to come down to world events. That's something that I don't, economists aren't going to be able to predict. But those estimates were produced in June. And so the war in Ukraine was already happening there. The price increases were already happening. And so that's been taken into account. But that's a big, huge variable, big bag of, who knows. Yeah, that's really going to depend. Unfortunately, I wish I could give more concrete answers.
Brigid, that's a supply issue, right? So assuming the supply continues to be disrupted as it has been, does the situation get worse or better in the future?
Well, I think that's right. And that's where it's tough, because we sort of, as economists who might think about this, we have very few tools, right, to solve that problem in the immediate term. I would be interested, David, if you think longer term. I mean, I guess economists would say longer term, if this were to drag out, we would shift production to other parts of the world. Now, not that into fertilizer production, but we may see some others, maybe potentially some other supplies come online that maybe would mitigate, but I'm not real familiar with how the system works. So I don't know how soon that could happen.
I would say that with the same issue of fertilizers, fuel, and the Russian exports and embargoes of that, and we're already seeing the European countries are moving away from Russian oil. They're expanding investment into nuclear energy and green energy. And depending on how all that goes and how quickly they're able to do it, I know that there was a rush to do it because the winter, and European winters are a lot colder than they are here in Puerto Rico. Depending on how that happens and the export pressure that puts on American natural gas, that's going to affect fuel prices here. And so all of what I just said about fuel is going to apply to fertilizer as well, how nations respond to it and whether or not they want to be reliant on export markets. And you can see that with, I think it was the Inflation Reduction Act, gave a lot of money to produce microchips here in the United States rather than relying on Chinese exports. Yeah.
Okay, any other questions?
David, could you put the link that you mentioned for where people can watch for those reports that you said are coming out? And could you explain that? I think I missed. Is this something that ERS does every 6 months, or how often do these get updated?
Yeah, so this branch, there's another branch that I'm not in that produced these specific estimates, but they released them on June 22nd and again on November 15th, and November 15th at 3 p.m. Eastern. So like an hour and 15 minutes. Really unfortunate timing that I'm giving you information which is going to immediately be out of date, but it is what it is, and I apologize for that. But I'll throw that in the chat. They produce it twice a year, and then also my branch puts out, I believe it's 3 times a year, forecasts on what farm income is going to be. And in that, we project farm income, government payments, and expenditures. And so again, really valuable market research so you can check yourself against your national average competitors.
Okay, we have a question in the chat from Dirk Bowman. He is with FEMA. Fuel is key right now, and the fact that farmers, oops, just lost it. Fact that farmers are having to ship more by truck than by barge down the major rivers of our nation due to historically low water levels. What is the impact and outlook economically?
Good question.
Either of you?
So I'll go first, and then maybe Brigid can follow up. So that's one thing that is going to be a really big deal, and supply chains are going to need to adapt. And we saw it even back with, what was it, the Evergreen, I think, the barge that blocked the Suez Canal. And unfortunately, I don't think the Mississippi River, I don't have an optimistic viewpoint about water levels in the Mississippi. But about 2 years ago, the University of Illinois put out a piece of research, and it was directly related. It was talking about interstate trade, the role of interstate trade and the effect on farm income with worsening climate change and extreme weather events. And essentially the finding was that interstate trade is going to relieve a lot of the financial impacts, the negative financial impacts on the farm economy caused by climate change. Basically, the way that works is that food is an inelastic good. If there's a weather shock and we lose half the supply of corn, people are going to be fighting with their wallets over whatever is left. And so as long as these weather events are uncorrelated across the country, these different regions are essentially going to take turns cutting production. To me, as an economist, I kind of see it like OPEC cartel action. And so the producers who are able to produce successfully are going to achieve much higher prices and become financially well off. But in the years that there's a weather event that affects them, their incomes are going to be low. So I would expect in the future, because of climate change, farm incomes are going to be more volatile, but potentially higher. And so that presents a great opportunity for farmers who are able to adopt technologies that are able to allow them to produce in spite of these weather events, whether that be immigration or I forget what they're called, the tunnels, the cellular tunnels, et cetera. But please, Brigid.
Well, that was a very intelligent response. So, David, I don't have much to add. I guess the question maybe for you, David, on that theme is like, when we see this economic upheaval, I guess one thing that goes through my brain is that we tend to, like you said, consumers are fighting with their wallet, and we tend to prioritize things a little differently. And I know you maybe can't speak for your agency, but just kind of the role that climate change or the importance or the demand that people are putting on it, does that become lost in the shuffle of all the other things that are happening in the economy? That would be my concern with some of this economic upheaval, is we're prioritizing things, and maybe the addressing climate change and some of the issues gets put down on the list a little bit.
Mm-hmm. So I'm a millennial, so I think we are naturally depressed and pessimistic people. But yeah, I don't have an optimistic view of climate change. I think it's going to be a tragedy. But the good thing for farmers is that food is pretty much always priority number one. And hopefully, we're always going to need food, and so farmers are always going to have a job. And again, climate change is going to be an opportunity. But how specific producers are going to fare, it's anyone's guess. It really depends on where you're located, what your aquifer levels are at, and how successful you're able to adapt with new technologies. Sorry, another thought that popped in, kind of back to the fertilizer thing. Cover crops and nitrogen fixing plants are extremely important for that. And I am very curious as a researcher if people planted more cover crops this year after they harvested.
That's
I definitely
a really
feel
good
like
question.
that's a growing trend, yes. And possibly we could check in with Sarah on that. I know they do a lot with that. So we'll maybe follow up on that. Okay, any other questions?
Yeah, I have a follow-up question, and this is probably for Brigid. You gave, I mean, it's a mixed story, right? It sounds good to say the costs are going up, but the cost of, the cost of goods are going up, but the cost of sales are going up. That's good. Then we got the maybe the price of inputs are coming down. We'll see more. But we also saw that land values are going up. So there's a trade-off. Is this, I mean, what branch in the research world, in the economics research world, gets that at the social factor of, are people staying in the farming and ranching business, or are they getting out? Do we know what that trend looks like? Because we certainly have talked a lot about food sovereignty, but we're talking cash crops here. We're not talking feeding communities. So do you guys look at those trends, or is that, something other than economists?
No, I think we watch those trends. I haven't watched them as much nationally as much as I would watch them in Minnesota. And I think we see a number of different factors playing out. We are seeing a lot more of the local foods kind of surge in Minnesota, especially with our tribes. Our Ojibwe tribes in the north in particular are very interested in this topic and really making some moves in that direction. But if you think even around our metro, like, it's very interesting. If you look at some of our metro ring counties, we see a lot of increase in more farms. They're smaller farms. So more and more kind of movement into that. But if you get out into real greater Minnesota, like you said, the cash crop piece, we're just continuing to see farmers age out, consolidation of land, bigger farms is kind of the story here in Minnesota. David, I don't know if you have a different perspective from kind of the national level.
Yeah, I think same thing pretty much goes with what I've seen. So the USDA does have an increased emphasis on researching socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers, American Indian farmers, et cetera, and beginning farmers and ranchers. That's a big emphasis of this current administration. And it's a big problem. And high land prices, it's very challenging because it plays a dual role as a incentive to exit and a barrier to entry. And frankly, people my age don't have a lot of money lying around to buy 1,000 acres and start a farm. And so I'm not personally involved too heavily in that sort of research, but the ERS is invested in studying it. And there are new reports being written now examining this issue of farm succession and transfer. And the thing that I think is most interesting is that when we talk about beginning farmers and ranchers, there's really two types. There's people who were born into a family of farmers, and then they're called the beginning farmer, but their great granddaddy owned 1,000 acres a long time ago. That's just passed down the line, and they've been farming their entire life. And then there's the people who don't come from a family. They don't have that generational wealth, and they're trying to enter the industry and have to face all of these barriers that the other group might not necessarily have to face.
David, as long as we've got this group together, we toured, Extension did a really awesome tour in northern Minnesota, some of our Ojibwe farms, and we were kind of talking with folks. And one of the kind of misconceptions, I guess, that I heard on that tour is about what is a definition of a farmer for the Census of Ag. And some of them felt like they weren't a farmer because they didn't meet this $2,000 sales figure or something like that. And someone else was like, no, you count as long as you're producing something. So could you clarify that for people here to just say, hey, fill out the survey either way, because we don't get the data if people don't fill out the survey, right? Even if we sample them.
Absolutely. And that's actually very related to the big project that I'm working on now. So a farm, according to the US Department of Agriculture, is any operation that produces or would ordinarily produce $1,000 worth of a commodity. That's not a lot. That's like a pickup truck full, So please, if you think you might qualify, reach out to the USDA, make sure you have, I think they call it a farm number, but you are supposed to be surveyed every 5 years and your responses matter. And under responses to surveys are really tragic when we are trying to target socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. So yeah.
Okay, we have Craig Harry that has a question.
Yeah, I guess kind of follow up on like the trend question of Marines. Do you think like any of the misconceptions around what farming and ranching is, especially in Native communities, between, I guess you would so call it, traditional natives and native ranchers, do you think that has an effect on any of the economy of Native communities? So many misconceptions of fake meat to real meat to how we're hurting the environment to the practices, like as myself as a native rancher, I know I dang sure don't hurt the environment because I don't use any of those chemicals or anything like that. Everything is pretty much organic, it's as organic as you get. But do you think some of that rhetoric in different areas has an impact on native economies in the ranching industry?
It's hard. It's to say. It's hard to say what the impact is. I absolutely 100% feel like there needs to be a better dialogue, right? Because like I said, I'm a farm kid from southern Minnesota. And when I go and visit with the Ojibwe growers and start to understand the way that they're approaching this it's a very different way of thinking about agriculture, right? And my worldview, I'm always kind of questioning my worldview, and I sometimes still can't get like I'll get through a lot of really great ideas about like the Three Sisters growing methods and all this stuff, and I'm like, this is cool. And then my worldview of it's all for cash just crashes in there, and I can't make the next leap. So I just, there's so much room for more understanding of the native way and how that is different and similar and all that kind of stuff. So if we can't understand it, how can we really value, I don't know.
And I guess that's
it's a tough question to answer.
I guess that's one of the things that we battle with on the reservations all the time in our economies, is just really the understanding of both sides of it, and really understanding how ranching happens for native communities, because in all aspects it's the same, we're growing the same, but in all aspects we do it a different way somewhat. There's different methods and stuff, but I mean we're basically going towards the same goal. And I know that just from some of that, from my personal view, I see it takes a toll on some of the economy effects from our reservations.
Yeah, I agree with that, Craig. And I think that one of the biggest factors in that is the limited land within a reservation. So everyone wants us to, get this next generation into ranching and farming, but you only have so many leases on a reservation, and people hold on to those like no other. And so how do we get this next generation into a lease so that they can
Exactly.
So
because I mean and I like to say that a lot too when we're talking to producers. I mean, all realization comes down to we're in a box. You know what I mean? But how do we expand our box? Or like even trying to get to your tribal council to make buying outside land a priority more than anything, to start gaining the acreage on the reservation so you can get more native producers, young producers in there. But
and it's a difficult
dynamic.
Because you have to understand too, on a reservation you have people that live in town that think that ranchers are rich because of the equipment that is necessary. And so for us, our leases are constantly raising. So even though this economic impact that both David and Brigid speak about, it's just a very different dynamic because, I mean, I don't think that a year has gone by where our leases haven't raised here on Cheyenne River.
I'm sure some folks have heard about it, just like what happened on the Lame Deer Reservation last week, or a week ago, where everything skyrocketed. council pushed forward the grazing fees, everything like, I think they're starting to have to pay $85 an acre for irrigated land.
Oh, my
And
gosh.
this all went through last week. So when I was talking to some of the younger producers, they're like, now our bankers are like, what do we do? How do you even make it? So then all of a sudden you just had some producers that are 2-3 years into starting. And now all of a sudden, because of the rates like that, it's like, now what do we do? You know, how are we
Wow.
gonna even make it? And
Yeah.
like, how are we gonna even make it economically? You know, we can't. So
No,
I
exactly.
think it's just a different aspect on everything when we're talking about native communities and the native economies there.
I agree. I love
I
your
just
input
wanted to
on that.
bring that up, you know, so.
Is
Yeah.
that in Lame Deer? What is that? That's tribal land
Mhm.
fees?